Welcome to today's segment of 5-Minute History with Hunter Cox. Today we will be discussing medieval Japan. Let's get fired up for some history. Often when we think of the term medieval, we often think of medieval Europe, but that's not always the case. There were also medieval times in other places around the world. The term medieval literally means middle. Japan also went through a medieval era, and that's who we're going to talk about today. Today we're primarily going to focus on the social structure of medieval Japan, starting from the top to the bottom. When talking about feudal Japanese society, the first group we really need to talk about is the emperor, or the emperors. Starting around 800 AD, it is important to realize that though the emperor was pretty much the de facto head of feudal Japan, they really held no true power. A large part of their decline in power came from a strand of strong leaders often followed by a set of weak leaders. Many of these weak leaders had to take on the role of emperor as young children, and many regents or assistants to the emperor had to help govern on behalf of these boy emperors. As these young emperors grew and became ready for the job, regents often would refuse to give up their power which they loved. During this era of Japanese feudalism, emperors were often more of a figurehead, and really they spent just a majority of their time focusing on the finer things such as studying their religion of Buddhism mixed with traditional ideas or writing poetry at their palace in Heian. Now this next group we're going to talk about is pretty much the true ruler of Japan during the feudal era. It's the Shogun. By the 1100s, the most powerful people in Japan fought for control using their armies. In 1180, the Genpei War began, and the ending of the war led to the creation of this thing known as the Shogun. The Shogun was arguably the most powerful and influential position one could hold in feudal Japan. The Shogun was basically the commander of all the emperor's military forces. This decision to create a Shogun basically created two types of governments in Japan. The emperor would often stay in his royal palace in Heian, along with his bureaucracy. The Shogun, however, began to set up his own government in Kamakura, which became known as a shogunate. Japan was ruled by a shogunate for the next 700 years. This group proved to be extremely effective and strong and became the leading group in Japanese society. They pretty much had a little bit of control over everything. The next group behind the shogun would be the Daimyo. The Daimyo were basically a group of people who were important to feudal Japan, and they pretty much served as lords. The time came when Japan was going to be divided into numerous small territories, and they were handed to the Daimyo to lead. Now the Daimyo pledged loyalty to the emperor, and especially to the shogun. The Daimyo also really had a lot of power because they had the ability to practically rule their territories however they chose as their own independent kingdoms. The Daimyo also made great use of the samurai in order to protect their lands. Samurai would then give an oath to the Daimyo to be loyal and to serve him. In exchange, the Daimyo would give samurai extra land. It got to the point where Japan would eventually become a conflict-prone area. The Daimyo resisted the shogun and vice versa. Fighting would spread throughout the country until the Ashikaga shogunate was brought down in 1567. And then the next group behind the Daimyo would be a group called the samurai, which we talked about a little bit earlier. To protect their lands and enforce the law, nobles or the Daimyo formed private armies. To help create these private armies, the nobles gave land to a group of warriors who agreed to fight for them. These warriors were known as the samurai. Samurai often fought on horseback with various weapons such as swords, daggers, and by even bow and arrow. Their armor was unique in that it was typically made of leather or steel scales and laced together with silk string. The name samurai translates to mean one who serves, and that is exactly what they did. They lived their lives by a code of conduct known as the Bushido. The Bushido demanded loyalty, honor, bravery, and courage. Pledging to fight, the samurai would often rather die in battle than ever betray their lord. They also felt the same way about being captured in battle. This same form of conduct went all the way up to World War II, in which many Japanese soldiers acting as samurai-type people would fight to their death, or they would rather commit suicide than to be captured or ever betray their lord. The final group we need to talk about are the peasants. The first thing we need to realize is that the peasants of feudal Japan were divided into several subclasses. The highest ranking of the peasants were farmers. Agriculture was very important to the success of these people. Farmers who owned their own land ranked higher than farmers who did not. Craftsmen or artisans were the second highest ranking group after the farmers. They worked with wood and metal, and some became well known as expert samurai sword makers. Merchants were the lowest ranking because it was felt they made their living off of other people's work. However, in later times when Japan began to use money more as currency, merchants would become more wealthy. In conclusion, much like medieval Europe, the social structure was very reliant on each group carrying out their own unique function. One could not make it without the other, and that's ultimately what's going to kind of lead to the fall of feudal Japan. So that's basically an overview on the social classes of feudal Japan. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and feel free to check in next time when we have a 5-minute history. Have a great day.